Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Ryan. I'm an MA candidate at Stony Brook University in New York, and I'm pursuing my degree in higher education administration. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here with all of you at the Association of Governing Boards' annual meeting. We're here to discuss transformations in leadership theory and practice. Today's talk is going to focus on network leadership theory and achieving workable unity toward current and future demands. So let's jump in. I'd like to begin with the man that inspired this talk for me personally. Does anyone recognize him from the photograph on the screen? If you don't, I would like to introduce you to Peter Gronn, Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge. He looks pretty happy, right? Maybe he knows something that we don't. In my exposure, Gronn's work in leadership theory and research is important to the discussion of higher education as a means to dissolve essential tensions between transforming new students into accomplished graduates. But how do we resolve this purgatory status in our leadership practices? We need new leadership configurations, such as network leadership, to take the reins. Before we get into the specifics of network leadership theory, I'd like to lay a communal foundation of what we already know. We already know that as educators and administrators in higher education and concerned fields, there's a complex set of demands that face institutions, the field of higher education, and those of students who are intending to transform into accomplished graduates. The traditional positivist leadership theories in higher education, such as the great man theory, things that focus on behaviors and characteristics, are no longer sufficient to guide our institutions and our leadership practices into the 21st century to solve issues around student persistence and student development and outcomes. Shared governance structures and democratic partnerships are endemic to higher education, so the one great man or woman can't get the job done anymore. This is where we need to leverage network leadership theory. In its foundation, network leadership is not exclusionary, which means it builds upon the positivist leadership theories pertaining to our attributes and our behaviors within the organization. Specifically, network leadership comprises individual and pluralities of leadership that function simultaneously as parallel and interwoven sources of influence. More generally, if we look at the concept of networking, it's about creating a fabric of personal contacts who you believe can then provide support, feedback, insight, resources, and information to help you address some operational challenges, but more importantly, be future-oriented. With consideration to the proliferation of demands as well as the bifurcated system that higher education typically operates in, the distinct theoretical promise here is its expansion to study leadership units beyond the boundaries of standalone organizations, which means we can facilitate analyses on an inter as well as an intra-organizational basis. An important piece of network leadership theory involves the unit size, which means we must control how big our circles are in certain spaces. If we are to try and scale this throughout an entire organization, without the right people in place and the management of leadership spaces, we risk disintegration of the concept of leadership itself, which means we must also be good stewards in terms of positivist leadership theory practices. This theoretical framework for thinking about leadership affords higher education professionals the latitude for interpreting local, national, and global environments, as well as its own idiosyncratic contexts. The tensions that we're all familiar with in terms of higher education then manifest themselves as ways to expel barriers. We begin here in the nature of our roles as leaders and educators, but we're also looking for elegant organization of leadership concepts and an agreement on terms, so we can apply these frames to our current situation and the situations of our students. It means reconciling process and the underlying web of beliefs that informs our practice. Short-term goals and long-term goals then must be interwoven. Without this key piece, we risk falling apart or disintegrating our leadership between operational cores and then personal and strategic networks, which we'll get to in a minute. Network leadership theory, or the goal of this emergent framework then in organizational practice, seeks to inform positions in the marketplace through processes of governance towards student success. We all desire a certain level of ownership in the work we do, and network leadership turns this desire into a demand. If we can nullify the insatiable accountability measures of external constituents by improving our student learning processes and outcomes toward adaptive leadership, we can all assume greater ownership of the core tasks of higher education without external interference. There are three conceptions of network leadership theory according to the Harvard Business Review. The first is operational networks, which are mostly prescribed by the task and organizational structure, which means we're concerned, or managers are concerned, with current internal responsibilities. The importance of network leadership in the operational space is the criterion for membership. Either you're necessary to the job and helping get it done, or you're not. Here we may understand the first limitation of the network theory. Operational networks are usually geared toward meeting objectives as assigned, not toward the strategic question, what should we be doing? Once a leader or someone assuming a leadership role has a strong understanding of the operational needs, meaning who and what is necessary to get work done, a leader should then begin to think about their personal networks and strategic networks. And these two networks differ in the sense that they offer leaders choice or discretion on who is a member and who is not. The personal network concerns breadth by reaching out to contacts who can make referrals, and the point of a referral is to gain an outside insight on what can possibly propel your business forward into a new strategic vision. Typically, membership manifests itself in terms of kindred spirits outside of the organization, or a danger of an excessively internal focus. And the entire goal is to expose problems and seek insight into solutions. This networking phase fosters a deep understanding of themselves, or the leaders in play, and the environments in which they move. The strategic network is the final form of leadership networking development and relies heavily on a strong personal network. Its primary goal in the strategic development is to open one's eyes to new business directions by creating and leveraging inside-outside links. This offers expertise outside of an internal focus, which can then guide future practices. By nature, these networks should be diverse in order to configure dispersed expertise. And perhaps most importantly, the network should be future-oriented and allow space for dependence to transform into mutual influence. This kind of influence allows leaders to strategically anticipate new imperatives and provide ideas about how to respond. It is worth noting many leaders drop their strategic networking precisely when they need it most, or when their units are in trouble, and only outside support can rescue them. The foundations of operational, personal, and strategic networks are found in Gronn's theoretical framework for leadership configurations, and its emergent framework draws on plural formations of leadership in four ways. The first is team-based activity, and the instrumental purpose is attaining effective outcomes. We must acknowledge there are self-leadership and shared leadership opportunities here. Gronn's unit of analysis continues to be the individual, except within groups or organizational contexts, but the point here is none of us are isolated persons. The second strand is the pooling of top-level management, which is expressed through interdependence and role complementarity. Gronn brings this idea to specificity in the unit analysis, which involves units or single-digit size groupings that occupy shared role spaces. The third strand focuses on the spread, in terms of projects and routines, of boundary-crossing leadership across hierarchical responsibility levels in organizations. These units span mandated and emergent combinations of individuals and small number groupings, and thus the duration of membership in these configurations varies and is fluid based on the project or routine. The last strand focuses on the attribution of leadership to situated activities and processes rather than persons. This does not concern the materials and shared process or activities, but a way of becoming and being, which Gronn describes as emergent, fleeting, fluid, and discursive in its construction. Let us all take a moment to read the text on the screen. As leaders, we must recognize the need for ambiguous spaces of leadership to occur and management of leadership role spaces in order for emergent leadership practices to come to fruition. Gronn acknowledges there are leadership surpluses and deficits that arise from the populating of spaces, which means we must utilize the operational, personal, and strategic network phases to improve the movement of resources around and between networks to accomplish a set of goals or tasks. Specifically, allowance has to be made for conflictual and not merely convergent sets of relations toward mutual accommodation. And now that we've had a foundation of our leadership configurations laid out, how do we organize these into powerful configurations? A caveat of network leadership theory regards the mobilization of bias, a term coined by Schatzschneider in 1960. In brief, it states, all forms of political organization have a bias in favor of the exploitation of some kind of conflict and the suppression of others, because organization itself is the mobilization of bias. Some of our issues are then organized into politics, while others are then organized out. A limitation of our leadership configurations then might be that leadership cannot be divorced from the system-wide social structures and processes to which is it embedded. Peter Gronn gives two examples specifically of powerful configurations, those that involve legacies and those of the realpolitik, or those that control budgets. The legacy of commitments inherited by leaders who assume a new role in an established organization, with its own culture, its own climate, its own direction, alignment, and commitment to ideas about work and its processes, either constrains or empowers those in leadership roles. Lastly, the realpolitik represents the other side of the coin. Nothing can be achieved without funding. Gronn suggests we find co-constructed ways in network theory for the academic core and administration to direct, align, and commit to future-oriented plans. To bring the concept of network leadership theory from rhetoric to reality, a review of conduct and working relations is required. According to Gronn, the conduct of joint work was shown to be concertive, which means the formation members were consciously aware of themselves as acting or functioning in a decision-making unit, and not merely as individuals. Thus, adoption of conjoined agency is required to move from dispersed cognition to configured cognition. A sense of synchronicity is embodied in respect of the unit members' coordination plans and with regard to members' influence on one another. The unit has mutuality and reciprocity. Time or timing is an important variable to explore in these spaces of configured cognition and conjoined agency as well. According to Gronn, work in the area of group agency then is timely, if only because of the objections encountered periodically in scholarly circles to any notion of a group mind or group-mindedness. We must then consider the advice of Walter Dill Scott, quondam president of Northwestern, as a challenge to successful network leadership. Every idea, concept, or conclusion which enters the mind is held as true unless hindered by some contradictory idea. Buy-in and belief toward future-oriented, co-constructed mutual accommodation are key membership criterion in the strategic network. Remember, the best networkers take every opportunity to give and receive from the network, whether they need help or not. To help think about group agency in a specific organization, Gronn introduces the term supervenience, which is being concerned with the relationship of and movement between different analytical levels, such as individual and group, and part and whole. It particularly concerns the status of the relationships between the individual contributions made by a group's members and the decisions, policies, and actions arrived at by the group. So what does that mean exactly? A group's agency is autonomous, but only in an epistemological sense, and it exerts downward pressure on the thinking of its members. Let's consider the we and I pronouns. Is the we a me and you thing, or is the we singular as in we the business or we the department? According to Gronn, we is understood as a corporate sense, as in a single unified center of attitude and action, which is distinct from the distributed or aggregated sense of we-ness. Hence, a limitation of the network theory is its latitude for interpretation of power and the construction of we. Further research and an accumulating body of finely tuned leadership cases would either resolve this limitation and grant steam to further study, or confirmation of its nature and shift the field of leadership research. This leads us to believe that collective wisdom is an indicator of the type of we that is constructed in the workplace or organization, specifically how it manifests. According to Landemore, it can manifest in two ways: through emergent supervenience and through a cognitively constructed environment, comprising diverse, decentralized, and dispersed intelligence. In closing, Peter Gronn's pressing need in network leadership theory and configurations resembles that of our entire industry. We need to get leadership and power back in harness together. We must do so by managing the leadership spaces within our organizations and the intra-organizational contexts, and space for collective wisdom to emerge across operations, personal dynamics, and strategic networks. The complexity of demands and needs in higher education, technology changes, competition, challenging economics, and the value of education in society requires it.